Thank you, Neil. It's a delight to be with you, and we look forward to that. We appreciate the U.S. Chamber being on the forefront of watching out for America's job creators. Thank you. So, the American Rescue Plan, we'll start with that. The dollar figure in the bill, $1.9 trillion, is staggering in its size. Before we talk about what's in the bill, I know the U.S. Chamber said before the bill was voted on that the legislation needed more focus, that it should have been more highly targeted. What about the bill caused concern for the U.S. Chamber?
Yeah, Don, it's a great question. So let's start in context. So this was, the third major legislative package, spending package, in response to COVID. In total, we're at over $5 trillion in borrowed money committed to fighting this pandemic. And we've learned a lot in the past year. If you think back to last spring, as the economy was shutting down, we knew that Congress had to act quickly to provide broad-based support. As the pandemic has worn on, what we've seen is that not every family, not every business, not every industry, or even every state have been hit equally. If your business is in restaurants or tourism or travel, you likely haven't really recovered at all as a result of this pandemic. But if you're in professional business services, even the construction industry, if you're in retail that delivers to people's homes, in many of those cases, those sectors are doing actually better than they were pre-pandemic. Our concern with this bill is that it made none of those differentiations, and it simply put more money out and didn't take into consideration whether someone had lost their job because of the pandemic, or whether a business was even losing money because of the pandemic, or even whether a state had suffered revenue loss. And so, in our mind, that meant it wasn't well targeted, which meant a lot of resources were going to waste.
So targeting the borrowed money to the need would have made more sense.
Would have made much more sense because there's lots of other things we need to do in this nation. Rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, get broadband to the areas that don't have it. But we can't borrow an infinite sum of money, and big tax increases are only going to hurt the economy as we're trying to recover. So just being a little bit more judicious with the spending and saying, listen, if you're unemployed, we want to help you. But if you haven't lost your job, if your income hasn't gone down, well, maybe that federal assistance shouldn't have been targeted to you in that instance. Maybe we should have put the resources where they were most needed.
We've learned that a tax today is a debt today is a tax tomorrow, and we've seen that in record time with this particular bill. What else is in the bill that job creators should need to know about?
Well, I mean, there are some good things in the bill, right? If you are unemployed, the extension of unemployment benefits is really important. Importantly, for that hard-hit restaurant industry, there is a program that's targeted just to you. That made sense in this moment because we know that they're some of the last businesses to be able to recover. So providing direct assistance to the restaurant industry, to the food and beverage industry, made a lot of sense. The other provisions included $350 billion in state and local aid. Some states are hurting, some localities are hurting, particularly if you're heavily reliant on revenue from tourism. But again, this wasn't well targeted. And so now a lot of states, a lot of localities are just figuring out how to kind of spend these funds that they're getting from Washington. And by the way, like any funds from Washington, it turns out it comes with some strings attached, strings that might make it harder for economies in Arizona, across the country, to actually adopt competitive tax policies to be able to grow.
So true. That was a real surprise to a lot of people to find that out, that had been inserted in the Senate version right before it passed. Let's move on to infrastructure. We all know the importance of infrastructure, whether it's highways or technology to aid water stewardship or broadband. As a border state, Arizona is especially concerned about keeping trade moving between our state and Mexico. Can you give us an update on what sort of infrastructure package might be considered this year and whether you think any such thing will pass?
I do think now is finally the year in which we're going to get an infrastructure bill done. The president's rolling out with a multi-trillion-dollar plan that frankly kind of stretches a little bit of the definition of infrastructure. Maybe it actually stretches the definition quite a bit. We do have real needs, all the things that you just mentioned, where we haven't been making investments for years and we ought to be making investments. Again, in the same way we talked about the COVID package, though we have to be targeted. We can't afford everything. We have to prioritize. We have to figure out what we can finance. Within that scope, I think there's a good opportunity to do roads and bridges and water systems and broadband deployment. There's bipartisan support for that, and I think we can come up with the money to pay for it in a responsible fashion.
How about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? I know our chamber was the state's most vocal advocate of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which greatly enhanced the competitiveness of the U.S. corporate tax code. Now we're hearing that the White House is considering a corporate tax increase to pay for infrastructure and the 1.9 trillion partisan only debt and other priorities. Obviously, that's a concern for the chamber. Can you discuss how a major tax increase is being received on Capitol Hill?
Well, as we said, this is a dangerously misguided way to try to pay for much needed infrastructure. I don't think, well, let me cut to the good news, Chase. I don't think these tax increases on businesses, on small businesses, on individual and on investment are going to survive on Capitol Hill. And we're doing everything we can, I know in partnership with you all, to make sure that that is absolutely the case. One of the reasons they're so misguided is it kind of misses the whole point. We adopted tax reform 4 years ago to become competitive. Now what's going to happen here is it's not that they're actually walking back tax reform. They're actually making the tax code worse than it was pre-tax reform. So remember, businesses, employers traded a lot of deductions and credits and special interest loopholes and everything else in exchange to get that, to pay for lowering that rate. So now, having given up the base broadeners, if you take the rate back up, we're actually going to be worse off than we were even during the Obama administration when it comes to international tax competitiveness. That's something that we can't do. It goes in the exact opposite direction of what we need out of an infrastructure package, and we're pretty hopeful and confident it'll be defeated.
That's a good thing because that would make it so much more likely that businesses and manufacturers would move out of the U.S. just to be able to globally compete. So thank you for your work on that.
Yeah, I always remind people, if you think about it, the U.S. used to be the best place in the world to do business. And in many ways, because of rule of law and our judicial system, we still are. But we became dead last amongst the developed nations of the world when it came to taxes. And so whenever there was a big merger or acquisition amongst international companies, all of a sudden it made tremendous economic sense to actually not be an American company. How in the world did that ever happen? It became InBev Anheuser-Busch rather than Anheuser-Busch InBev. I mean, there's nothing more American than beer, and the idea that we're going to allow an American company because of our tax policy. We're going to incent that to become a subsidiary of a foreign company. That was a real mistake, and we finally fixed that. We started seeing companies move more stuff onshore back here, creating more jobs here. And this tax proposal would simply undo all of that.
I know my family received pressure years ago that we needed to move to China or someplace else in order to be competitive in golf club manufacturing. And we're patriots. We stayed here, and so glad we did. That Tax Cuts and Jobs Act made us so much more competitive, and Arizona is such a great business-friendly place to manufacture and do business. We're so glad that we stuck it out, and I really hope that we will continue to be competitive moving forward.
Yeah, all these tax changes that have been proposed would do was give a leg up to your competitors abroad. Why in the world would we ever want to do that and make it harder for a U.S. company to compete?
So true. So the infamous filibuster, moving on to that. In the Senate, the 1.9 trillion legislation was passed with a simple majority because it was considered under what's called reconciliation, meaning that the 60 votes to cut off a potential filibuster weren't necessary. What's the U.S. Chamber's position on the filibuster?
Well, only in Washington is the idea that when we're going to make huge, dramatic policy changes that impact the lives of everyday Americans, Only in Washington is the requirement that we get 60 out of 100 people to agree before making those type of radical changes considered outrageous. The truth is that the filibuster requirement forces both parties to work together. And if there's something really important that has to be addressed, it forces them to compromise. What that does is it gets buy-in into the system. It means that the policy changes that are adopted aren't likely to be subject to the partisan whims or the electoral winds of the moment, but instead are going to be durable. I suspect in your business, Don, you make plans for your investments, for your business, many years into the future, right? Well, that's what every business does. And you base those on the idea that in America, the laws, the tax system, things are generally stable. Well, that stability goes out the window when the filibuster goes away. Think about this. Joe Biden is the third president in a row to assume office with his party controlling both the House and the Senate. In a world in which there's no filibuster, the Democrats take policy and run it to one extreme. And then the next election produces a Republican unified government, and they undo all of that and run it to their extreme. And then the next election produces the opposite, and we just go back and forth. That's exactly, from a business community standpoint, what we have to avoid. And instead, we should maintain this requirement that brings the parties together, that forces them to compromise. It was the way the late Senator John McCain operated. He never liked it when they tried to even use reconciliation back in the day to run roughshod over one party. I think he had that exactly right. And empowering a majority, who's only a majority because of the tie-breaking vote of the vice president, to run roughshod over the other 50 senators is a dangerous, dangerous precedent.
So
I feel a little strong.
should we?
I'm not sure if you could tell.
No, and rightly so. Rightly so. It's so important. Breaking that filibuster would be bad for business, bad for jobs, bad for our economy, bad for our citizens. But do you think we should expect a vote on a tax increase to be sneaked in under reconciliation to avoid those 60 votes?
I think it could be done under reconciliation. And listen, I think there's blame on both parties for abusing the reconciliation process. Under Obama, the Democrats used it to create Obamacare. The Republicans came in and tried to use it to undo aspects of the Affordable Care Act. Republicans came in and did it to do tax reform. Now, that tax reform bill was really good. It was really important for all the reasons that we talked about. Had, however, it been done on a bipartisan basis, maybe we would have compromised on some of the details to get that bipartisan support, but maybe it would have the bipartisan buy-in now that we wouldn't be faced with the prospect of now Democrats trying to use reconciliation to undo it. And so the one thing that you get when both parties come together is you get that durability. And I would trade a little bit of I would trade a little bit of policy for long-term stability that helps American businesses to plan.
That's right. Thank you. Finally, the PRO Act. Arizona is a right-to-work state, so we're looking at the PRO Act with real concern. Our chamber supports our right-to-work status, and we support secret ballots in union organizing elections, as well as the ability to work as an independent contractor for worker so chooses. So why should Arizonans be concerned about the PRO Act? What are the bill's chances in the Senate?
So it all depends on the filibuster. If the filibuster goes away, this is exactly the type of legislation that can pass, that can't pass in a world in which the filibuster exists. It doesn't have 60 votes, and there's a very good reason for that. This is the most radical remake of labor policy, perhaps ever in the United States history. So Arizona's right to work law, it's one of a majority of states that has such a law, instantly overturned. So it doesn't matter what the people of Arizona said. Washington's going to tell you what your policy is. Your ability to work as an independent contractor, it doesn't matter what Arizona has said. This is saying what California said for their citizens is now going to apply for the entire nation. The idea of a secret ballot, that goes out the window. Interestingly, one of the things they do here, and this is just insane to me, is that if an employer and a union are having a dispute, the union can go picket the customers and the suppliers of that business. So imagine the social discord you create when you're picketing other businesses for unrelated labor disputes. All this and a lot more would happen if the filibuster goes away and the PRO Act becomes law.
Wow, these are really high stakes. Thank you so much, Neil. And again, thank you for lending us your expertise and your time today. And thank you for all that you do to promote Arizona's and the US's job creators. We are grateful for you.
Thanks so much for having me, Don. Have a great day.
Thanks. You do the same.